Hey guys, welcome back. I have a fun episode this week. I've actually got two guests. One is Jamie Caldwell, the other one is Kent Phoebus. So they work together at South Shore Church. They also happen to be brothers in law. And Jamie also works with church planners in the Baptist Convention in Maryland and Delaware. And so I'm excited for them to be able to share with you some of the challenges they've experienced and some ways they've dealt with those challenges. Welcome back to the Speak Life podcast. Hey, welcome back for another episode of the Speak Life podcast. This week, I've got Jamie Caldwell, who is and I'm having to look at my other screen, the State Director of Church Planting for Maryland and Delaware, and Pastor of Preaching and Vision at South Shore Church I said Annapolis, you said a different town name. It's right outside of Annapolis.
Either one works. It's Crownsville is the technical address, but Annapolis is the only one people will recognize.
Okay, so Annapolis, Maryland area, and then Kent Phoebus, who is the pastor of spiritual formation at South Shore Church, and also has the distinction of having been my next door neighbor at Southwestern way back when.
That's right.
When we all when I met the two of you, you guys have a closer connection in that you're brother-in-laws, right? And so
That's
you
correct.
guys have been, Kent, how long have you been married now?
We will celebrate 25 years in May. So
Oh, nice.
yeah. So
All right.
it's been a long time. So
Yeah. So, because I think you'd been married for about 10 minutes when we met, right? I mean, it
yeah, it
seems
had
like it's
not been
been that
long.
long ago.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
so what
yeah.
I want to do, so I'm giving away a little bit of stuff. Why don't each of you Jamie, why don't you go first, and each of you take a few moments and just introduce yourselves, talk a little bit about your family, your history and ministry, things like that.
Yeah, man. God called me to ministry when I was 18. I grew up in a pastor's home that's like 6 generations deep. But because of that, probably I did not want to be a pastor. So I started flying planes in high school, and I had a scholarship to go fly planes at a little school in Florida. And while I was there, God just wrecked me and
Mm.
helped me realize that flying had become this idolatry that I was pursuing to get away from ministry. So
Wow.
quickly just quit everything, just left school, canceled everything, packed my car up, drove home to Ohio, called my dad, and was like, hey, man, God's called me to ministry. And my dad said something along the lines of, man, don't do anything rash. I'll come down there and we'll talk it through. And I'm like, don't worry. I've quit everything. We can talk about it in 15 minutes when I get to the house. It'll be great. So yeah, 18 years old. And shortly after that, I actually met Kent. And I tell everybody that I'm in ministry today doing what I do because Kent was a very gracious, kind discipler who let me preach at church camps and youth groups, even when he probably should have fired me, and just was like, hey, let's not say those kinds of things anymore. Like, let's just stick more to the Bible, and developed me and discipled me and cared about me. So that's kind of our story. I got married 21 years ago. So in
All right.
2003, I married my wife, who I also met that summer of 1999 after I graduated high school. And it's been a whirlwind. We moved a bunch, did school. I went to Southeastern, Southwestern, and Southern. So if I can make it
All
to
right.
Midwestern, man, I feel like I'm just going to make a round and do all of them. I'm going to run out of degrees. But uh, but yeah, we ended up in Maryland shortly around 2008. So about 5 years after we got married. And we've been here ever since in a variety of roles. But we planted a church called Redemption in 2013 on our 10th wedding anniversary, which is a bad idea. Like, not a great 10th wedding anniversary gift for your wife.
Okay.
But that's what we did. And now the church is just turned 11 in January of this year. And we call it South Shore because in 2019, we went through a merge with a Baptist church that was sort of aging out. But yeah, I think that's about the entire story.
All right. Kent, what about you?
Yeah. My story, it's interesting as I'm thinking about it. Jamie and I's stories interweave a lot. I was in school, had just graduated from a community college in North Carolina. The church I was attending there was just really involved in the church and ministry, and the youth pastor who was there was like, hey, you should help out and maybe lead a small group and those kind of things. And so as I started doing that, Jamie and his family moved into town, and Jamie was a high school senior at the time, and so he was actually in my small group. And so that's kind of how our relationship started. I actually tell everybody I was friends with him before I married his sister, so or started dating
Yeah.
his sister. So everybody thinks it may have been the other way around, like we were forced to be friends, but I was friends with Jamie first. So,
Nice.
but no, was in ministry at the time, serving in that way, volunteering, and then just felt God kind of leading me into ministry. And I really didn't know what that looked like, what that meant. And that was in February of 98. And then in October of 98, we felt called to move, um, to West Virginia. So I got married, felt called to move to West Virginia to be a part of ministry there. And so, yeah, just saw this opportunity to be a part-time, or I guess a volunteer youth pastor. It was a unpaid internship,
Mhm.
and that kind of changed, kind of moved things along. And so, felt God doing that. Started being a youth pastor, became a youth pastor, was that for 20 years. And then just stepped into a new role here in the past 5 years, working with the God just allowed the opportunity for Jamie and I to start working together. And so, yeah, it's been an interesting, crazy ride. So for
Yeah,
sure. So yeah, yeah,
that's cool. So you,
yeah.
where in West Virginia were you?
I was in Williamstown, West Virginia. So,
Okay.
so yeah, Parkersburg area.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is, Jamie's wife, Abby, she was actually a part of the church that I was working at. So, like I said, there's so much interweaving of our
Yeah,
stories
that's wild.
of ministry and stuff. So yeah, it's like, it's really cool to step back now this far out and think about it and just see how God's worked through that and use that. So.
Yeah, and so it's interesting for me talking to you guys and realizing I was not that far away from where you were. Like when I first started in ministry, it was a youth ministry
Mm.
position in LaVale, Maryland. Uh,
Okay.
maybe an hour or so from
Yeah,
Parkersburg, and so I was right in that neighborhood before we ended up moving to Southwestern. So it's
that's
funny to
funny.
me that we were that close, and then we ended up being next door neighbors at
Yeah,
Southwestern way back in the day.
that's
With
right.
I remember your girls were pretty little. I think when you guys moved in, my daughter wasn't even born yet. I think that was after. And then because she
I
was
think
only a
you're
year
right.
old when we
Yeah.
moved
Yep.
away. And
Yep.
now, like my oldest is married. I just saw wedding pictures of Kennedy the other day. It's like time
Yeah.
has flown
Yeah.
on by.
Both of my kids are married. So
Yeah.
both of them got married last year. So yeah, my wife and I are stepping into a new realm of life for us of being empty nesters and trying to figure out what that looks like for us. And so yeah, it's
Yeah.
a fun time right now.
Yeah. That's kind of the transition we're actually making. So my daughter is getting ready to
Mm.
go to college in the fall in Colorado. And so we'll be just the two of us at the house, which is what we are most of the time now anyway, because she's never around. So just the busyness of a senior in high school. So So all of that aside, and a little bit of catching up there aside, the two big questions we typically ask on this podcast are: what are the top two or three greatest challenges you've either seen or experienced in ministry? And it sounds like you're going to be able to feed into that from varied positions. You've served with youth, you've served as a pastor, you've served as a doing church planning and some church revitalization along the way, and so you're going to have pretty unique voices coming into that
Mm.
question. Top two or three greatest challenges you've seen or experienced in ministry, and then what are some of the suggestions you'd give for dealing with those challenges? So why don't we just jump in? What are some of the things that you would bring up that you'd say this is an issue that we've seen?
Sure. I'll go first. I was thinking, Um, you know, as I mentioned, being a student pastor for a while, I did that for 20 years. And I feel like during that time, I felt like people felt sorry for me because I had done it for so long.
Mm,
It was I got the joking question always like, hey, when are you going to become a real pastor or those kind of things. But I kind of allowed that uh, I kind of started to buy into that a little bit. Like my role wasn't
yeah.
that significant. It wasn't that important. And I think sometimes would forget the calling that God had laid on my life at that point, in some ways.
Yeah.
And then, dealing with that, I feel like it caused me to kind of put my head down and just do my work and just kind of not communicate really well with the people I was working with and those kind of things. And then I wish, thinking back to it, I wish that I had, um, been better at communicating, but also taken time to know how and learn how to lead up in the position I was in, because I definitely
Mhm.
had ideas or thoughts or what I think could have been helpful to what was going on, but I just never. I always thought, they don't want to hear from me because I'm just a youth pastor, those kind of things.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I've seen that. I've talked to a lot of guys that struggle with that when they're not, um, the main guy, the lead guy. How do I lead up in that position? And I think a lot of people struggle with it because a lot of people, when they step in and trying to lead up, it doesn't come off as leading up. It comes off as complaining, or it can come off. It doesn't come the same because they don't know how to do that. And so I had to really learn how to speak into that and make sure that I did it in a way that was valuable to the people I worked with. So.
All right. Jimmy, how would you speak into that?
Man, and to Kent's story or to the question of the challenge?
So let's stick with what Kent's talking about there first, and then we'll come back to other views on
Yeah,
the challenges.
100%. So in a lot of ways, it's unique because Kent was my like small group leader, and when I would get to preach for him, he was the boss. So we have this unique relationship where I watched Kent sort of take a back seat in places where I was like, man, like I could tell that wasn't your idea. Like that was the thing that you probably like, did
Yeah.
you? And he was like, I don't know. And we pushed through that. But I've done my best here to just try to elevate like his voice as a lead guy to make sure it's not just my voice. And I like to talk and I like to be in front of people. So it takes time for me to sort of lean back and be like, let other people speak into this. Because leading up is one thing, but also allowing people to lead up I think is a really important piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, because we're really that's what occurs to me is we're talking about two things. We're talking about first of all, I think it goes beyond staff. It goes to a culture within the church as a whole of almost a dismissiveness of the call when it's any position besides senior pastor,
Yeah,
especially, and I think student ministry is the worst one as far as like
absolutely.
when are you gonna like it's viewed almost universally as a stepping stone ministry, and there's not a consideration of there are some people who are called to minister to teens.
Yeah,
That like that's a big deal, significant call.
yeah,
And so that's one piece of the puzzle is that how do we deal with that culture that is not just within the leadership of the church, but is within the congregation in the church. And then the other part of it is, and so how in a multi-staff church situation, even if multi-staff means there's a senior pastor and we've looked around and gone, hey, there's some teenagers around here. We need a youth guy, and so then there's a part-time youth guy or maybe a full-time youth guy, and that is the extent of multi-staff. uh, how does the senior pastor go about making room for that lead up to be able to happen, for that voice to be heard and validated, and a call, really the call validated?
Yeah,
What are ways to be intentional about doing that?
man. And this will lead into part of what I'm going to talk about when we talk about the challenge that I faced is being able to stay in my lane.
Mm,
Recognize that every guy that God calls, every woman that God calls into any position, volunteer, staff, pastoral, deacon, whatever it might be, they've got their own unique matrix of gifts and desires and affections and energies. And I've got to give space to those things.
yeah,
And one of the things that I want to do is fix, right? Like there's a hole and it's
yeah,
hard to let it sit there, right? Like I had to learn early on that sometimes you just have to let a fire burn for someone else to step into ministry to put it out. But I'm quick to try to step in. So for me, it's really been trying to take a back seat, but not
yeah,
just like to do less, but just to do exactly what it is God called me to do and nothing else.
yeah,
yeah. Yeah, I was going to say, I had two thoughts. One, you mentioned and I had said it too, but kind of people look down on the student pastor, youth ministry, and that kind of thing. I would say I've been around a lot of youth pastors in 20 years and even 25 years now. There are some of them that deserve to have them look down on that way. They definitely fit the perception that people had about them.
Yeah.
But then there was guys that I feel like myself that really felt called to it, really were trying to do that. And I've always enjoyed the second role of pastoring. I don't,
Hmm.
I can lead. I don't mind to do it, but I enjoy the collaborative work and working alongside somebody and trying to lead together. I think that's why Jamie and I work well together, because there are a lot of things that it is his position that he leads in, but then there's some things that I would say that we co-pastor on that just works really well for our church. And but that takes a unique submission
Yeah.
to each other. It's tough. And yeah, you just have to learn to work together, but you have to have the desire for what the end goal is that the church that you're serving is being served correctly. It has nothing to do with who's doing it. It's that it's being done.
Yeah.
And so that you have to have that mindset. And it's hard. You have to fight. I really think you have to step back and fight for unity within what's going on. Like step back from, hey, they're not letting me do this. They're not, those kind of things, and then fight for
Yeah.
the unity. And, I had a pastor that I worked with one time just tell me, I remember him saying, he's like, hey, I need you to share with us sometimes about some of the things you're thinking. Cause he's like, I see that you hold back. He's like, you have a unique perspective on some of the things. And he said, even if it's not right, it gets us thinking
Yep.
differently and it causes us. And so I needed to hear that, because I always felt like I had a different perspective a lot of times, but I was afraid to say it because I would get shot down. And I did. I've had people I've worked with before that would shoot it down, and they'd
Yeah.
be right away. And that guy allowing me to do that pastor, that was super helpful to me, because I was like, okay, I'm not weird. I mean, I know I'm weird, but I was like, I'm not weird. And,
Yeah.
and so that was good. So,
So I'm hearing that, and there's something occurring to me that when we think about the idea of how a senior leadership team at the church, right? How when there's this sense of making space for one another, of inviting people in, and I like the way you phrased it, fighting for unity, right?
mhm.
Uh, when you do that at the leadership level, part of what I'm thinking through here is, the idea of it's more of an academic term. It's the idea of shared governance, right?
Yes.
Who are the different
Mhm.
constituents in their different lanes and how they all contribute. And it occurs to me in the church setting, you have the different people who are on staff, but that's still one collective group. There's also the congregation. And I'm thinking through what it models for the congregation when the pastoral staff is able to work together well and make room for one another's voices, what that models for the congregation, for the church as a whole, and invites them in to speaking into what we do and gives them room to voice ideas and move forward. That's one of the things that I know I've appreciated about my church here is we have just a phenomenal level of congregational involvement in various ministries that go on. And sometimes they're the ones bringing up the idea because God laid it on their heart and created a passion in them for it. And then to see them just be fueled, and then we get a liaison from the pastoral staff connected so that we can give them the resources they need, and it stays connected to the full mission of the church. It's a really cool way to pursue ministry that not every place does.
Yeah. And I feel like sometimes senior leadership, there's this quest for excellence
Mm.
that we hide behind
Yep.
that keeps people from stepping into things. And there's a guy in our area that worked for the Sin Network, passed away last year, but his name was Clint Clifton, and he had this thing that he would always say, and it was that anything worth doing is worth doing poorly at first.
Yep.
And we've just owned that, right? Which means sometimes I'll let a guy preach, not on that week between Christmas and New Year's when nobody comes to church. I'll let him preach on a
Yep.
Sunday when people will actually be there to hear him, even if
Yep.
he may not be the best, because you've got to figure out how to get better, and we've got to make space for that.
Yep.
So
Yeah, that's exciting stuff. What it sounded like, Jamie, in the middle of all that, you had something else that you were going to bring up as a challenge that you've seen or experienced.
man, so it's weird how well connected these are. I think my biggest challenge in ministry, and what I see most from my gung ho church planters in Baltimore and DC and Maryland and Delaware, is overactivity.
Mm,
And usually, I think it's driven by insecurity. So even if you don't think that yours is driven by insecurity, I've been coming back
yeah,
to 1 Samuel 15 over and over again, right? Like Saul has just won a victory before the Lord. Things are good. He's supposed to offer or wait for the prophet to come and offer the sacrifice. He does it on his own instead of waiting.
yep,
And then when Samuel begins to rebuke him, he says, though you were small in your own eyes, God elevated you. And I think the fact that Saul was small in his own eyes, and then a little bit
yeah,
later, he says, I was afraid of the people and I was afraid of the enemy. And I think because of that, Saul
yeah,
stepped out of his lane and he did stuff that he wasn't called or equipped to do because he didn't want to wait for somebody else to do it. And that has been my ongoing struggle. And it looks like 1,000 different things. So,
yeah,
I mean, early on, we grew the church by doing one-on-one meetings with guys, right? Like I was a new pastor of a small church plant. There were a couple dozen people at most. I didn't really have an office. So I just made an offer. And I was like, if you guys want to meet with me and read the Bible, we will. And a handful of guys said yes. And it went well. So then more guys were like, I want to do that. So we kept doing it. And there got to be a point, probably 2.5 or 3 years in, where I'm trying to run 23, 24, like 1 hour one-on-one discipleship meetings a week.
wow,
And the quality has clearly diminished in all of them. The
yeah,
quality of disciples being produced has diminished. And I just hit a wall. And it was a mess. And it was because I just didn't release these guys to go do the thing. Because I was doing it so well and it worked so well
yep,
that it was like almost the fruit of the ministry and obedience became the root of disobedience in my life. I'm like, look what God used me to do. I'll just keep doing more and more and more instead of walking with him.
yeah. That it's interesting. So, Ken, I want to hear from you on this here in a second. But it's interesting. The guy I just did an episode with last week is the director for developing leaders here in Missouri. His name is Jim Maslowski, and one of the kind of quotable quotes he gave me was the idea that there seems to be this myth for young pastors that to succeed in the pastorate, what you have to do is get better and better at doing more and more, instead of turning people loose, uh, allowing them to do ministry, even if it doesn't look exactly the way it will look if you're the one doing it, recognizing God's going to work through them, that he's given them a passion for it, that they're willing to step into it. And there's significant value in that. Because we only go so far. We're finite. We have limited time. We have limited energy. Uh, yeah, I totally get it. And I like the tie-in on insecurity because that makes a ton of sense on why some of those things happen. Like I can reflect on my own life and see where that's happened at different points.
And it keeps it coming, right? So it's like there's this drive to be okay.
Yeah,
But I find that when instead of like it's overactivity out of insecurity, or I can flip it and I can do actual ministry from a place of intimacy.
yeah,
And that is just like, it's sustainable and it's joyful and it's better. And that's the model, right? Because
yeah,
if I model overactivity, my people do overactivity.
yep,
Yeah.
And it just burns us all out. One of my favorite guys in the world is a young church planter nearby. And his church is one of those stories that like people write books about. Just really good at stuff. God's blessed and it's been awesome. And he sat down with me one day and was very serious and was like, Jamie, do you know your church would be bigger if you did more? I was like, buddy, I don't think you understand how this thing works. And we just had a really fantastic
yeah,
conversation. And out of that came this phrase that I'm sort of like known for now by my church planters in a mocking and sarcastic way. But I said something about how my goal is to do less, but to do it for the glory of God. And that's simply become that Jamie does
yeah.
less for the glory of God than anybody else we know. So we'll see how it all plays. But
All right, Ken, what are your thoughts as you're hearing that?
Yeah. No, Jamie and I have this conversation quite a bit. I mean, we actually just had this conversation maybe like 3 or 4 days ago about uh, the opportunity we had for a new small group, and
Mhm.
we were debating on who should be doing it. Like, Jamie's like, I could do it, and I'm like, you could, but you probably shouldn't. And yeah, we have that a lot because there's just opportunities all the time that you can do, but you have to, I think the goal is trying to model, number one, model for our church what that looks like, but also who can we raise up to take some of those positions? I mean, that is what we're called to. We're called to equip the saints for the work of the
Yeah.
ministry. And I find too many times we equip the saints to watch us do the work of the ministry. And
Yeah.
it just like, I think uh, I think that's where we fail a lot of times. And, and so, I definitely have caught myself in that. I just came off of a sabbatical,
Hmm.
about a month and a half ago. And, during that time for me, for sure, I just really had a chance to step back and think about what I was doing in ministry, why I was doing those things. I would say it was less, I would say less spiritual awakening, more probably reflective of myself and like what
Hmm.
God was doing in my life, why I was doing it. I had a chance just to kind of consider some of those things.
Yeah.
And I remember hearing something, and I can't remember where it was, but somebody was speaking about just our calendars as pastors, looking at our calendars, and if our calendar is more task driven than it is passion or priority driven, then we will find ourselves in a bad spot. And is there tasks and stuff that we have to do? Yes, but I think you can craft your calendar and your day in such a way that it allows you to do those in a passion slash priority type way that causes you to enjoy the things that you're doing and just
Yeah.
not to be a slave to your calendar because it can happen real quick. And then you hate your job, you hate your life, like it's not good. And so that's something I've really stepped out of, that trying to consider what that looks like for me. And when I start feeling the way that I did prior to sabbatical, I just start looking at the past couple days and saying, well, what do your days look like? How are you
Yeah.
investing in those? And so that's been a key to me to what I've been trying to do better at for sure.
Yeah, there are really two things that come to mind here, and I think they tie together. One of them is, as we think through this idea of uh, kind of just getting to the place where we're doing more and more for the glory of God, that even the wording of that, we kind of baptize it, right? We baptize the busyness in that I'm called to serve. I'm called to be here and to serve. And I like the way you said that, Ken. It turns into, instead of equipping the saints, we equip the saints to watch us do the ministry
Mm,
instead of
yeah.
equipping the saints to do the ministry themselves. The other piece that goes into that is when the way you're talking about the calendar and how that's laid out, and if it's task oriented or if it's actually priority oriented. That's one of the things I used to see all the time with clients, especially, frankly, clients who were males and who struggled with being angry. Uh,
Mm,
we would take the time to really think through, okay, what are your priorities in life? And now, what does your weekly schedule look like? And you're telling me that family is real important to you, and I see almost no time for family in your calendar.
mm.
Huh. Right. I mean, and so just thinking through
Yeah.
how that applies to ministry, if there's this desire, if the calling is to do some certain things in ministry, but then that's not what the calendar ends up looking like. It's an idea of how do we protect, what we're called to do, so that we're accomplishing the ministry that needs to be accomplished, but in a way that produces longevity instead of burnout.
Mm,
Yeah,
mm,
absolutely. And I think from a very practical perspective, the hardest part of this is learning how to disappoint the right people.
Mm,
So we've got people who move into this area all the time because we're a military hub and a government contract
yep.
hub. So we're very transient, right? Like it's kind of funny. We get a new church every 3 years. So I just get to
Yeah.
recycle all the same sermons. It's just great. But it's a turnover that's almost constant. But because of that, we've got people in our church right now who come from churches with pastors that I love and respect, right? Like big names, small names, guys I know locally, guys I know nationally, but like all these names, but they all come with a different vision of what I'm supposed to do for them.
Yeah.
And when I try to be all those things, like it just destroys me.
Yeah.
When we first planted the church, I tell a story all the time. I babysat for a couple. I had my own son at home, and I left my wife to go babysit for a couple in the church, not because I was trying to serve or meet a need. Like they definitely were wealthier than I was. Their house was bigger. They had all that, like they
Yeah.
could have paid for a sitter. It just felt like there was this expectation that pastor serve. So I said yes to everything. And I got home that night and I was like, I do not know why this is what I'm doing. Like, this doesn't feel like the ministry that God has called me or gifted me for. Like, it's just the weirdest thing. And it's just one of 1,000 examples of things that I should have just said, listen, that's not the thing that I do. But that's humbling to say. And I hate saying it.
Yeah.
So I had to learn how to disappoint people.
Yeah. It's interesting how that, that kind of ties back into the insecurity thing we were talking about earlier. Like I want to continue to serve. I want to continue to be viable. If I say no to this, am I still serving? And there's so much, and I know this is something I've experienced in the past. There's so much self-doubt that can be wrapped up in that of, okay, so God, I don't think you're telling me, are you really maybe telling me this? And I'm missing it and I'm not catching it. And really I need to step into and do, and it can be challenging. So for me then, so as we think through, okay, so how do you deal with some of these things? One of them is just to really make sure you're staying rooted in the Lord with your own personal quiet time and your personal relationship with the Lord. So you're leading from that in everything you do, because then that helps you to stay centered on, no, I'm not telling you to go babysitter. I'm not telling you to go do this. I'm telling you this other thing. I also like the practical, examine your calendar. Think through what you're seeing on there. Does that fit? Does that fit within the boundaries of what you're called to do? Or is it oriented the wrong way? What are some other practical things that you guys would suggest for dealing with some of those challenges?
Kent, do you want to have anything? I'll let you go first if you do.
I mean, it still sticks with the calendar. I think, or kind of just the way I prioritize my time probably more than anything. I read a book over sabbatical, and basically it kind of gave an idea of looking at the time of the day from 6 a.m. to all the way to back to 6 a.m. So like your 24-hour cycle, basically rating your time of day that from green, yellow to red based on your best energy, And so I found that to be super helpful for me, because it has put me in a place where I do things based on when I'm going to do them best, right? So, and that has been a game changer for me in the sense of knowing myself, knowing when I'm going to be the most tired, knowing when I have the most energy, just attacking the things that I need to get done at the right times. And it's been super helpful to me in that sense, because it's freed my mind up of am I giving my best to the day, first of all?
Yeah.
But then it also frees me up to say, hey, this time is a good time for me to meet with people. This is a good time for me to do, whether it's discipleship or whatever that looks like. That's just been super helpful to me for sure.
Yeah, that exact book. What do you happen to remember the name of that book?
It's by Carey Nieuwhof, and I can't think of the name of the title of. I'm drawing a blank, but
yeah, that's all right. So it's Nieuwhof text. That's actually the one that. So my wife's the children's ministry director at our church, and all of the discipleship ministry staff just went through that exact book and did a book study on it, talking about it. So as soon as you started, I was like, I'm about to get red, yellow, green. And it's been a game changer for her too, and for them as well. They really like it.
Yeah.
That's also, we did that at the staff, but I applied it to my family, right?
Yeah.
Like my best time with my wife, mornings. My best time with my 14-year-old son, night, right? So like, I just plan like, okay, I'm going to stay up a little bit later with him and wake up a little bit earlier with her. But that means I'm going to take a nap in the middle of the day, which is my red anyway, right?
Yeah.
Like you do not want to have a meeting with me at 4 o'clock. It's just you're going to get the worst of Jamie in every possible way.
Yeah.
So, but I also understand the reality of pastoring is that we're on call. So just a
Right.
blanket statement over all this that says God gives grace when grace is needed. So when a crisis happens, when an emergency happens, when it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon or in the morning and somebody needs me and they really need me, God allows that to work.
Yeah.
So I understand the reality of on call. So I don't want that to be an excuse to be like, well, they don't understand what I'm dealing with because I'm the only guy. It's more important if you're the only guy to guard your heart and to guard your time because it's so easy for good things to pull you away from the best thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's the Mary Martha, right? Like that whole word picture, the word, like the distraction is literally to be pulled away from Jesus. And what she's being pulled away by is much serving, or the word for diaconate, right? Much ministry is pulling her away from Jesus.
Yeah.
She's so busy working for him that she can't be with him.
Yeah.
And she gets mad at him for not recognizing how helpful she's being. And I've lived that. Like, Jesus, I'm doing all of this. I do not know why you're not just blessing it. Why you're not doing. I'm keeping up my end of the deal. Where are you at in this? And that's where, when you mentioned anger earlier and priorities in the calendar, I'm like, man, I've seen that in my heart, in my life.
Yeah. It's easy to have happen. It's easy because, I mean, we live in a culture that celebrates busyness, right? I mean, how many conversations have you had even this week where somebody's asked you how your week's going, and when you tell them and you come back at them, how's your week going? Oh, so busy. Right? It's how we describe our world, and it's not necessarily helpful.
No.
I'm hating
people
that
also hide.
What's that?
I said people also hide from us as pastors, as me as pastors, because they use my busyness as an excuse to not reach out. Well, I'm sure you're super busy. I'm not. You can call me. Oh, okay. And they still don't, right? And it's like, I just don't want to bother you. And I'm like, I've told you, it's not a bother. Like, let me do what God's called me to do.
Yeah, which that kind of speaks into just the value in being intentional about not responding with, "Oh, I'm just so busy. Oh, I've got all this stuff going on." When we're intentional about not responding that way, it opens the door for those kind of communications. So a second ago, I started to say I hate what I hate is that we're out of time. we're at that place. This has been, I think, a really valuable conversation. Any final thoughts that either of you want to share? Jamie, why don't you go first?
And just real quick, I think one of the keys behind all of this for me was defining exactly who God made me to be and what he called me to do. And to do that in community and without condemnation. And that was massive because I will say yes to everything unless I have a clear rubric of what I'm allowed to say no to.
Yeah. Ken?
I've just kind of tried to think through just being confident in the call that God has given me and allowing that to play itself out, like not shy away from that, that. I think that's been what's driving me lately is like, I know what I'm called to do and I'm going to do everything around what I do around that to make that, see that happen, I guess. So, yeah.
All right. Guys, thank you so much for being on and for sharing today. I really appreciate it. I'm glad we got the chance to catch up and do this. For all of you who are watching, thanks for joining us. And we'll have a new episode for you next week. God bless.